Okay, today I'm going to talk to you about the agricultural revolution. If you take a look at this map in front of you, or this image in front of you, it's a picture of the Central Valley in California, which is a region with a lot of farming. And you can see these like grid marks and these kind of different colored boxes. And those are all farms. So basically, before these farms, there was just open forest. And so the agricultural revolution, which starts about 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, was a big change from human foraging. So the textbook you've been reading, This Foraging World by David Christian, it divides human history into three different eras. And it's basically based on the amount of energy that they can produce and like their primary ways of eating and living. The first was the foraging era. The next is the agrarian era, which is basically farming. The agricultural revolution sets this off in 10,000 to 8,000 BCE. And then you have the modern era, which is really the industrial revolution. So foraging has to do with hunting and gathering. Agrarian has to do with farming, and modern era has to do with using factories. This is a good way to categorize it because you can look at the population increase. Nomadic or foraging has relatively little. In agrarian or farming, the population grows as technology grows, and then by the modern era, population skyrockets through factories. The agricultural revolution also starts off at different times in different regions of the globe. And so our question really is why? It doesn't start in one region and then spread as much as it starts independently in different regions. Because remember, it's not really until 1492 or sometime in the 15th century when people in Europe, Africa, and Asia are interacting with people in the Americas. So how did people in the Americas develop agriculture at, basically at a different time than Egypt and Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent? So just a review of terms, domestication is it's basically like selecting the best animals and plants that you want to domesticate. So unlike evolution, this is human selection. So dogs are one of, if not the first animals to be domesticated. Tubers, or like potatoes and sweet potatoes, those might have been the first plants to be domesticated because basically you can just cut off the root and replant the root and a new potato will grow. So it's pretty easy. Agriculture is a little more complicated. It has to do with like setting up a system or practice of farming that requires both plants and animals. So it's a combination of the two. So it's a little more complicated and it takes longer to do. The Neolithic Revolution, again, this is a term that can sometimes be substituted for the agricultural revolution. I had this graphic and I like this graphic. Unfortunately, it says Neolithic Revolution on top of it, but it's an interaction of different things. Okay, so in order to actually have this change of lifestyle for early humans, you have a lot of different things interacting. Population, technology, the fact that they're living in sedentary or stationary communities, domestication, all of these things interact to change the way humans live. Okay, remember, Neolithic means new Stone Age humans. Old or Paleolithic Stone Age humans were before agriculture. Okay, so if you need a pause and review, remember at any time you can, but let's look specifically at population and what this is going to do. So extensive growth, again, this is populations expanding their range and growing. So it's humans moving into new areas without increasing their population density. Intensive growth means humans are growing in population and in population density. So they're not necessarily moving into new places, they're just adding more people to the old places. So that's a big strain on resources. So then you have a carrying capacity, which is kind of like the limit that a land can hold. And then you have Malthusian theory, which is this idea that the population will just expand by like consuming its resources, and it reaches this limit, this carrying capacity. When it reaches that limit, it crashes. So the population starts to die off until it comes back to this balance, right? So as humans are foraging, Paleolithic humans moved around. They were nomadic. They foraged looking for plants and animals, and they did it in these family units. And as they kept expanding and growing, they were able to find new areas of the world to move into. But at some point, right around 10,000 BC, they had basically colonized most of the easy areas. There were some small areas that they would eventually move into, like New Zealand, which you can see on the southeast coast of Australia. These were regions that they would eventually move into later. But by 10,000 BC, the easy places were taken up. Okay, so if they stayed in those same places, they would just keep eating and consuming their resources. So something had to change. Now, one thing that began to happen is some humans found places where there was plenty of food, an abundance of food. A really good example is the Tlingit people, the Tlingit people is the way it's actually pronounced. They, right around 8,000 BCE, they really were stationary. And if you take a look at this graphic, this is what the Tlingit people look like. They're located in southeast Alaska and northwest Canada. So you can see the red region in the map. They basically survived off of like lots and lots of salmon and berries, and there's plenty of food there. The key is water. So you can see they're very, very focused on water. Their culture surrounds around water. And I don't mean seawater as much as just rainwater. So this region of the world is very, very wet. It gets a lot of rain. There's a lot of rivers, and that feeds the people. So the Tlingit are a good example of affluent foragers, or these sedentary, stationary people. And they were able to find parts of the world that had an abundance of food, and they didn't have to leave it. Now, around 10,000 BCE, lots of regions of the world started to have extra water, okay, because the climate began to warm. There are lots of theories for why, but we do know that it began to warm. So about 10,000 years ago, the last ice age ends. The planet gets warmer and wetter. Many areas start to have more plants and animals, and that basically means that they're fertile or able to sustain life. The first really big region where this happens is the Fertile Crescent. So you might understand now where the term comes from, Fertile Crescent. Now, if we go back to our timeline and we see which region develops agriculture first, it's the Fertile Crescent, or Egypt and Mesopotamia. Okay? Now, this is a good map that if you want to pause and just look at which kinds of crops and animals that you eat today, where they originated. But another idea we have here is that certain plants and animals are better than others for agriculture. So humans first started to experiment with these tubers, or these sweet potatoes, but in the Fertile Crescent you had better kinds of crops for agriculture, like wheat and barley. So what you can do with these crops is you can basically grind them up and store them, and you can turn them into bread, you can turn them into beer, which was something that a lot of early humans drank for like carbs, for energy. So some advantages to what we call surplus crops, or extra crops that you can store. They're high energy, you can store them, and they're really strong and plentiful. They don't get wiped out in a flood as easily as, say, like your vegetables. Another thing that the Fertile Crescent is going to have are specific kinds of animals that work well for agriculture. You can see sheep, cattle, and goats in particular. So this abundance of animals that can be used in agriculture, combined with this abundance of plants that can be stored and are really, really strong and good for sustaining populations, that's going to make this the Fertile Crescent. Just as an idea, you could pause and take a look at this map and see where all the normal, the farm animals you typically see, where do they come from? What's so important about this is that domesticating these animals, it allows humans to have more energy efficiency. So an example are dairy cows. You can get more caloric energy, so basically like more bang for your buck, by drinking milk, and it's actually more energy efficient than eating the meat. Another idea for how you can use these animals is sheep. So instead of actually killing animals and using their leather for warmth, you can use wool, and the wool grows back, and it's actually even warmer. So humans start realizing that certain animals give them greater energy efficiency, so more bang for their buck. But the best way that animals are more energy efficiency is doing labor for humans, what we call beasts of burden. So certain animals, donkeys, cows, ox, they're actually much stronger than humans. They're fairly docile, so you can train them. Um, and humans eventually will like hook them up to plows and get them to do their work for them. Now, humans basically use these beasts of burden, which are typically at first found in the Fertile Crescent, later in Asia and India. They use them to help them get extra surpluses of food. And this idea of surplus is going to be really important later on. Just as a side note, some people figure out how to domesticate animals without needing crops. Some examples are pastoral nomads that are in like the Saharan region of Africa, in Mongolia, in the Arabian Peninsula, and these are going to be important later on. But being able to domesticate doesn't mean you have to farm. It just means that you found a better way for using a plant or an animal. Now, this is actually going to help populations grow over time, because as they were migrating and finding new areas, they developed new techniques. And so as humans start to interact with one another, they will start to share their farming techniques. The exception is in the Americas and in small regions like Papua New Guinea. They're kind of cut off, and so they don't get these new expansions and these new ideas. But regions like the Fertile Crescent, India and China, by around like 1000 or maybe 0 CE, so like 2,000 years ago, they really start to interact, and their farming techniques spread, and so the population will start to accelerate. Okay. Now, just as an idea of how they do this, males are very often the hunters. Women and children gather or forage for plants and food. These are going to be some of our first what we call specializations, or like specific jobs. But agriculture is going to open up a whole lot of different kinds of jobs, what we might call a division of labor, or like a job system. And with these different jobs and people interacting closely with their environment, working hard in a close-knit community, they figure out new skills for farming, new ways of domesticating, and over time, because these farming communities, these agricultural communities have more people in the same area, they exchange skills and they work with one another. So they can sustain more people, more food, and the population continues to increase. So it's kind of this chain reaction. More people settle down in an area, and then they start to pass on new skills, and the population is going to increase. So it's this combination that leads to agriculture, right? And this new system of agriculture is going to allow, because it has a surplus and extra food, it's going to allow new specializations like soldiers, priests, and even artists, technology people. So just looking ahead, these first farming communities are going to evolve into towns and then cities. What we'll eventually see is the first walled city, which is called Jericho. It's maybe 10,000 years old. And just as another example, this is an interaction of different things coming together to make these first farming communities. So you can pause for a second and take a look at this for review if you need to. But basically, this helps to explain why different regions of the world develop agriculture at different times. Asia, New Guinea, Sub-Saharan Africa, these regions will all eventually have too many people in a small area. They will find an abundance of crops, and they will use that abundance to select the best and eventually find a system of agriculture. The problem is not all of these regions have equal and as equal of beneficial plants and animals. So some regions like New Guinea are not going to be able to develop the big populations and the tools and the ideas that regions with better crops and animals are going to develop. Lastly, there are some negative effects of agriculture. Like it's really hard work. They worked harder than foragers. They're more prone to disease and famine and drought. They're interacting with animals all day. They interact with the environment in a way that they can't just leave. If there's a drought, they're dependent on their food. And it damages the surrounding ecosystem quite a bit. So the ecosystem isn't as robust and it can't deal with changes as well. It also can lead to collapse. If the population gets enough food and they eat too much of the food too quickly, then the soil is depleted and they can't grow more food, and all of a sudden you have a bunch of people without food. Okay. Now, you can review this as much as you need to, but the key here is that agriculture allows people to have, excuse me, it allows more people to be in a smaller area, right? And it also allows more different kinds of people, different jobs, because agriculture allows a surplus of crops, crops that can be stored. More people will be able to do things other than just look for food. Okay, and this is going to have a huge impact on civilization. All right.